I am deeply aware of this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities of sovereignty.
Just moments ago, the British monarchy was thrown into turmoil after shocking developments inside the palace suggested that King Charles may have taken a step no one expected, quietly triggering the path toward abdication. What was once dismissed as speculation has now erupted into a full-blown royal crisis, with Prince William suddenly emerging at the center of events that could change the crown forever. According to multiple palace insiders, a private sequence of decisions, hidden meetings, and sealed documents has accelerated plans that were never meant to surface this soon. Even more explosive is the claim that Queen Camilla's actions behind closed doors may have played a decisive role in pushing the monarchy to this breaking point. What was intended as discretion has now become exposure. Sources describe rising tension between senior royals, with trust fractured at the highest level. Prince William's recent movements, his sudden visibility, increased authority, and carefully staged public appearances are now being reinterpreted as preparation. Not coincidence. The question gripping the nation is no longer if power is shifting, but how far it has already gone. As whispers of betrayal collide with constitutional reality, the palace is scrambling to control the narrative, but the silence itself is speaking volumes. If these revelations are true, Britain may be witnessing the fastest and most dramatic transition of royal power in modern history, one shaped not by tradition alone, but by betrayal, secrecy, and an irreversible loss of trust. The palace has long operated on silence, tradition, and controlled appearances, but behind the stone walls and ceremonial smiles, the events now unfolding suggest a rupture far deeper than the public has been led to believe. In recent weeks, a series of quiet but significant moves has taken place, moves that insiders describe as unprecedented in speed and seriousness. At the center of this storm stands King Charles, a monarch whose reign was always expected to be transitional, yet never anticipated to face such intense internal strain so early. According to senior palace sources, Charles has been under mounting pressure not from public opinion, but from within the royal household itself. Meetings once routine have become tense, carefully documented, and increasingly restricted to a very small circle of advisors. What has alarmed royal observers most is the sudden activation of constitutional procedures, normally reserved for extreme circumstances. While no public declaration has been made, legal mechanisms connected to succession planning have reportedly been reviewed, updated, and discreetly circulated. Such steps do not indicate symbolism, they indicate readiness. Prince William's role in these developments cannot be ignored. Over a remarkably short period, the Prince of Wales has assumed responsibilities that traditionally remain distant until the final stages of a monarch's reign. His presence at high-level briefings, his expanded authority over royal strategy, and his increasing visibility in matters of state suggest preparation rather than mere support. Yet what truly destabilized the internal balance was the emergence of allegations involving Queen Camilla. Described by insiders as a breach of expectation, her actions were not public scandals, but private decisions that allegedly altered trust within the royal structure. These were not matters of infidelity or tabloid intrigue, but strategic interventions that, according to sources, crossed lines long respected inside the monarchy. The Queen's involvement in certain communications and advisory processes reportedly bypassed established protocols, placing her influence ahead of constitutional neutrality, while her defenders insist her intentions were protective. Critics inside the palace argue that these moves undermined confidence at a critical moment. In an institution built on hierarchy and restraint, perception can be as damaging as action. This internal fracture is believed to have forced King Charles into a position of reflection. Advisors describe a monarch grappling not with ambition, but with responsibility. The question he reportedly faced was not whether he could continue, but whether continuing would deepen division. For a king who has spent a lifetime preparing for the crown, the weight of that question cannot be overstated. Prince William, meanwhile, has maintained a public composure that masks intense private pressure. Those close to him describe a man reluctant to accelerate succession, Yet increasingly aware that delay could destabilize the institution he is sworn to protect. His silence has been deliberate, his appearances measured, and his messaging carefully aligned with unity rather than ambition. The public, however, has begun to sense that something fundamental is shifting. The language of official statements has subtly changed, emphasizing continuity, resilience, and duty rather than longevity. These are not accidental word choices. In royal communication, language is policy. What makes this moment particularly volatile is the emotional undercurrent. This is not simply a constitutional process. It is a family reckoning unfolding under global scrutiny. Loyalty, trust, and legacy are being tested simultaneously. Every decision carries historical weight, and every misstep risks eroding public confidence built over generations. International observers have also taken notice. The monarchy's stability is not merely symbolic. It is entwined with Britain's global identity. Any suggestion of abrupt transition sends ripples far beyond the United Kingdom, prompting diplomatic recalculations and renewed attention to the Crown's evolving role. In a modern world, as pressure builds, the palace remains outwardly composed. But insiders warn that the calm is strategic, not reassuring. Silence, in this case, is not denial. It is containment, and containment suggests that the truth, whatever its final shape, is powerful enough to require careful release. What is now undeniable is that the monarchy stands at a crossroads. Whether King Charles ultimately abdicates or not, the mere activation of succession mechanisms marks a defining moment. Trust has been questioned, authority recalibrated, and the future accelerated by circumstances no one planned to reveal so soon. And as Britain watches, waiting for clarity, one reality becomes increasingly clear. The Crown is no longer moving at its own traditional pace. It is being pushed forward by forces within, by fractured confidence, exposed loyalties, and a truth that may soon demand acknowledgement. As internal pressure intensified, the palace entered what insiders describe as a containment phase, a period where information flow was narrowed, loyalty quietly assessed, and every move scrutinized for potential fallout. This was not damage control for the public eye, but stabilization behind closed doors. The monarchy was no longer managing image alone. It was managing fracture. King Charles reportedly convened a limited series of private consultations with constitutional advisors and senior household officials. These meetings were notable not for their frequency, but for their exclusivity. Long-standing aides were absent. New voices, known for legal precision rather than ceremonial loyalty, were brought in. The message was unmistakable. This was no longer about optics. It was about authority, succession, and risk. At the same time, Prince William's position continued to evolve. Observers noticed subtle but meaningful shifts. Briefings once routed through the King's office began flowing through William's circle. Strategic discussions regarding public engagement, international representation, and long-term planning increasingly bore his imprint. Nothing was announced. Everything was felt. Those close to William insist that this transition was not driven by ambition. In fact, the Prince of Wales was said to have resisted any perception of eagerness. Yet the institution itself was moving faster than personal preference. When confidence at the center wavers, continuity becomes the priority, and William represented certainty. The role of Queen Camilla, however, remained the most sensitive fault line. According to palace sources, trust was not lost in a single moment, but eroded through a series of decisions that cumulatively altered internal dynamics. Her involvement in advisory communications, once informal and supportive, reportedly crossed into strategic territory traditionally reserved for constitutional actors. This shift unsettled senior figures who viewed neutrality as the monarchy's most fragile asset. Even the appearance of influence can compromise legitimacy, and in this case, appearances multiplied rapidly. Whispers of favoritism, agenda setting, and selective access began circulating within the palace, fueling quiet resentment and strategic concern. For King Charles, this placed his reign in an impossible bind. Defending Camilla risked alienating institutional guardians. Confronting the situation risked personal fracture. Advisors describe a monarch increasingly isolated, not physically, but emotionally navigating a convergence of duty, loyalty, and legacy with no precedent to guide him. Meanwhile, the public narrative remained deliberately restrained. Official engagements continued. Smiles were maintained. Ceremonies unfolded as scheduled. Yet beneath the surface, royal messaging subtly shifted away from permanence toward preparedness. Phrases emphasizing endurance were replaced with those emphasizing stability through change. Prince William's public appearances grew more symbolic. His tone was measured, his language careful, his demeanor resolute. He spoke not as a challenger, but as a steward, reinforcing unity, duty, and continuity. This distinction mattered. In moments of transition, perception shapes legitimacy. Behind the scenes, contingency planning accelerated. Briefings explored scenarios that once felt hypothetical, timelines, transitional protocols, and the psychological impact of a sudden shift. While abdication was never publicly named, it was clearly being modeled. The monarchy was preparing not for inevitability, but for readiness. International reaction quietly mirrored domestic concern. Diplomatic channels sought reassurance. Commonwealth leaders monitored developments closely. The crown's stability has long been a symbol of continuity beyond borders, and any suggestion of abrupt change carries global implications. What complicated matters further was the emotional undercurrent within the royal family itself. This was not a mechanical transfer of power. It was a reckoning among individuals bound by blood, history, and expectation. Relationships were tested under unprecedented strain. Silence replaced conversation. Distance replaced familiarity. For Prince William, the weight of expectation intensified. Every gesture was analyzed. Every absence was noted. Yet those close to him describe a man deeply aware of the cost of acceleration. He understood that stepping forward too quickly could deepen division, but stepping back could risk institutional drift. As the palace moved deeper into controlled silence, one truth became impossible to ignore. The monarchy was no longer reacting to rumor. It was responding to internal reality. Trust had shifted. Authority was being recalibrated. And time, once the crown's greatest ally, was now its most pressing constraint. The public may not yet know the full extent of what has unfolded, but the signals are unmistakable. This is not speculation. It is structural movement. Whether King Charles ultimately abdicates or reasserts control, the balance of the monarchy has already changed. And as preparations continue quietly, the question is no longer about betrayal alone. It is about consequence. Because once the machinery of succession begins to turn, even slowly, it reshapes everything in its path. By the time whispers of abdication began circulating beyond palace walls, the internal shift was already well underway. Those closest to the crown described this phase not as chaos, but as a quiet realignment, one where authority, influence, and trust subtly moved away from tradition and toward necessity. The monarchy was adapting in real time, even as it appeared unchanged to the public. At the heart of this recalibration stood Prince William. His increasing presence was no longer symbolic alone. It had become operational. Decisions regarding public messaging, future engagements, and institutional priorities increasingly bore his approval. While King Charles remained formally in command, insiders noted that execution and strategy were now being shaped elsewhere. This dual structure created an unspoken tension. Two centers of gravity cannot coexist indefinitely within a monarchy. Advisors were careful, deliberate, and discreet. But the reality was clear. The crown was beginning to function, as though transition was not hypothetical, but imminent. What intensified this momentum was the growing acknowledgement that restoring internal trust might be impossible without decisive action. The issues surrounding Queen Camilla had evolved beyond individual decisions into a broader concern about boundaries. Even those sympathetic to her position privately conceded that the perception of overreach had become too damaging to ignore. Attempts to recalibrate influence reportedly came too late. Confidence, once shaken at the highest level, is not easily repaired. The monarchy depends not only on loyalty, but on predictability. When lines blur, uncertainty follows, and uncertainty is the crown's greatest vulnerability. King Charles was said to be acutely aware of this. Far from being pressured into abdication, Sources suggest he wrestled with the idea as an act of containment rather than surrender. The goal was not to step away, but to prevent further erosion of institutional confidence. In this context, abdication was reframed not as retreat, but as stewardship. For Prince William, the situation demanded restraint as much as readiness. He reportedly resisted any appearance of inevitability. Emphasizing respect for his father while preparing for responsibility, he never sought to accelerate. This balance, honoring continuity while safeguarding the future, became his defining challenge. Public signals continued to emerge, subtle yet unmistakable. Senior courtiers spoke increasingly about long-term resilience. Briefings highlighted evolution rather than tradition. Even ceremonial language softened, focusing on service rather than reign. These were not stylistic changes. They were strategic cues. The emotional toll within the family deepened. Relationships that once relied on familiarity were now filtered through protocol. Conversations were cautious. Trust was conditional. The human cost of constitutional duty became painfully visible behind closed doors. Even as the palace maintained its composed exterior, international observers began adjusting expectations. Commonwealth leaders quietly prepared for the possibility of a new monarch sooner than anticipated. Diplomatic messaging emphasized continuity regardless of timing. The crown, after all, is not only a national institution, it is a global symbol. And symbols must not fracture. As speculation intensified, the palace remained publicly silent. This silence was deliberate. Premature confirmation could destabilize markets, unsettle alliances, and fracture public confidence. Control of timing became paramount. The monarchy would move when ready, not when demanded. Yet readiness itself became the defining factor. By activating succession frameworks, expanding William's authority, and narrowing advisory circles, the palace crossed a threshold. Even without announcement, the machinery of transition was engaged. Once engaged, it cannot simply be undone. For King Charles, this marked a deeply personal reckoning. His entire life had been shaped by waiting, waiting to serve, waiting to lead, waiting to reign. Now, the question before him was whether leadership meant holding on, or knowing when to let go for the sake of the institution he had waited a lifetime to inherit. For Prince William, the burden was equally heavy. The crown he was being prepared to receive was not arriving through ceremony alone, but through crisis. Legitimacy, he knew, would be measured not by coronation, but by how the transition was handled, with dignity, unity, and restraint. As the palace moved closer to a decision point, one truth became increasingly unavoidable. The monarchy was no longer defined by tradition alone. It was being reshaped by circumstance, perception, and the delicate balance between personal loyalty and institutional survival. Whether abdication is formally declared or indefinitely deferred, the moment has already altered the crown. Authority has shifted, trust has been tested, and history is now unfolding not in public spectacle, but in quiet decisions made behind closed doors. Decisions that will define the monarchy for generations to come. As the palace reached the final stages of internal deliberation, the focus shifted from preparation to consequence. What had begun as quiet contingency planning now demanded resolution. The monarchy could not remain indefinitely suspended between two centers of authority. Without risking long-term damage, stability, the crown's most valuable currency, required clarity. King Charles was reportedly presented with a stark assessment from senior advisors. The institution could survive uncertainty only briefly. Public trust, once strained, is not easily restored, and prolonged ambiguity would invite speculation far more damaging than any managed transition. In that context, the idea of abdication was no longer theoretical. It became a tool of preservation. Those close to the king describe a moment of sober acceptance rather than defeat. Charles, a monarch deeply conscious of history, understood that legacy is shaped as much by timing as by tenure. His reign, though shorter than anticipated, was never meant to be defined by endurance alone. It was meant to be defined by responsibility. Prince William's readiness was no longer in question. By this stage, operational leadership had already shifted. Senior officials were aligned. Advisory frameworks were in place. International partners had been quietly reassured. What remained was not capability, but legitimacy, and legitimacy in a constitutional monarchy is forged through unity, not urgency. The issue of Queen Camilla remained unresolved in public, but internally, boundaries were clearly redrawn. Her role, once expansive and influential, was deliberately narrowed to remove any perception of interference. This recalibration was not punitive, but corrective, an acknowledgement that even well-intentioned involvement can destabilize an institution built on neutrality. For Prince William, the path forward demanded careful balance. He was acutely aware that any appearance of triumph would fracture trust irreparably. His tone remained restrained, his messaging focused on service rather than succession. He did not speak of change, he spoke of continuity, stability, and duty. Public sentiment, meanwhile, began to shift. Initial shock gave way to reflection. Many recognized that a modern monarchy must adapt not only to public expectation, but to internal reality. The idea that abdication could be an act of strength rather than weakness began to take hold. When preparations for a formal transition reached their final phase, secrecy became absolute. Only a handful of individuals were informed of timelines. Documentation was finalized. Ceremonial contingencies were mapped with precision. The crown would move forward deliberately, without spectacle, without haste.